You might recall that we're skipping chapter 8 of Theology of Culture. So mini lecture number 8 is on chapter 9, Science and Theology, a discussion with Einstein. As you hopefully know, Albert Einstein was probably the greatest physicist of the 20th century. He was Jewish in background, and in his own way, he was a religious man. He had problems with evidence from quantum mechanics that events on this small scale, on the quantum level, happen by chance. And he had a famous quote, God doesn't play dice with the universe. But Einstein did not believe in a personal God. We could say that his understanding of God was more pantheistic, that there's this ultimate intelligence that's manifested in the scientific laws of the universe. And Einstein indeed spoke out against the idea of a personal God. And this chapter is fairly simply organized in a pretty clear-cut way. Einstein offers 4 reasons against the idea of a personal God, as Tillich summarizes Einstein's thinking. And then Tillich replies to each of these objections to the idea of a personal God. Okay, so let's first look at Einstein and what he thought. Number 1, he claimed that a personal God is not essential for religion. And Tillich replies that, well, you're right, Einstein, if religion was only about ethics. No, we wouldn't need this idea of a personal God if religion only was about finding good standards of right and wrong for society. But religion is a lot more. Religion is a lot deeper than that. The second objection is that the idea of a personal God comes from primitive superstition, according to Einstein. It goes back to thinking there's a spirit in the mountain, or there's a god of the sun, there's a goddess of the moon, and eventually we have a really big anthropomorphized supreme deity who's a glorified human being who supposedly controls everything. But this all goes back to primitive superstition, primitive myths about supernatural human-like beings. Well, Tillich says, again, you sort of have a point, Einstein, but, and you're right insofar as this idea of a personal God or personal gods and goddesses, yes, this type of idea has been abused. And we've seen how Tillich thinks that even many theologians, not just everyday believers, sometimes get this idea of a personal God all wrong because they think of God as this highest being who's separated from everything else, but still just a being, rather than being itself or the ground of being that's in everything and in which everything resides. So yes, this idea is abused, but the idea transcends mythology. And here I put a greater sign. It's greater than just these mythological understandings of a divine being. Because this concept takes in the idea of the infinite. It's more than just a finite being who's the highest being, but it's this infinite depth that's behind and within everything. And that's the screen on which this idea of a personal God is projected. This screen that is being itself, that in some sense is everything, all being. So it's something deeper. It's something more than just a primitive mythological idea. Okay, let's get to Einstein's third objection. It's self-contradictory. He claims this idea of a supposedly omnipotent God who controls everything. What's the problem? Well, it's the problem of evil, that age-old problem of evil. If this individual anthropomorphized highest being named God, or called God, is all-powerful, then why is there any evil? If God were actually all-powerful and all good, there would be no evil at all, according to Einstein's logic here. Well, Tillich tries to correct Einstein by saying you've got a misunderstanding of the proper idea of omnipotence. Literally all-powerful, or in some sense all power is God's or comes from God. Tillich says, no, that doesn't mean that God controls everything. It doesn't mean predestination. It doesn't mean that God controls everything, including our ultimate destiny in either heaven or hell. No. What it means is several things. That God, first of all, that God does respect the integrity, the freedom of creation. God respects the natural objects, the natural laws of the universe, the natural processes, including quantum mechanics, and lets those act according to their nature. Conscious beings, animals, and even more so with self-conscious beings, like human beings, God allows us to have freedom to make decisions. So no, God doesn't. Omnipotence doesn't mean God controls everything, even though all existence ultimately comes from God. And number two, and most importantly, according to Tillich, what God's ultimate power means is that nothing separates us from the love of God. Finally, none of the negativities of life or death can separate us from the love of God. That's the true meaning of God being all-powerful. Finally, number four. According to Einstein, this idea of a personal God totally contradicts the scientific worldview. This is the idea that God created the world in a more or less according to a literal reading of Genesis or of the Quran. This entails for Einstein that God interferes with these laws of nature. God causes miracles in the sense of violating or superseding the laws that God supposedly has created. So, what does Tillich say to this? How does he answer this fourth and final objection from Einstein to the idea of a personal God? Well, he does break this fourth part down into three parts. And he agrees, basically, with Einstein that we should not think of God as a God of the gaps, as a God who violates the natural processes, the natural laws that God has created. And in the exchange between science and religion, this term God of the gaps is used in the following way, that some traditional believers kind of figure, well, if we haven't found something yet, if we haven't found a scientific explanation, like how we got from this pre-human creature to one of our ancestors according to human evolution, how did we get to Homo erectus, one of our ancestors? Well, God must have intervened. So we try to find God or limit God as a God of the gaps. And Tillich says, no, you're right, Einstein. That's bad theology. That's bad theology. That's just not the only bad science or going against the scientific worldview, but that's bad theology. And until it does make a kind of general point about the whole nature of this exchange between, this dialogue between Tillich and Einstein by saying the following, that okay, when people talk about physics, when Einstein talks about physics, he assumes the best of contemporary physics. It takes in Einstein's own relativity theories. It takes in quantum mechanics. We're not going back to Newtonian mechanics when we talk about all we know of physics today, or the best of physics today. And Tillich says, you know, Einstein, you really ought to do the same thing when it comes to theology. Instead of doing bad theology, the theology that is still around today, but it's also kind of the bad theology of former years, instead of talking about that, you ought to talk about better examples of contemporary Christian theology. Theology that doesn't take a literalistic interpretation of the Bible, that doesn't understand the Bible as a blow-by-blow scientific or historical account of the unfolding of the universe or the unfolding of the earth and its history. So he, in that vein, he says Einstein illegitimately mixes two types of things, mythology and then interprets that literally. He mixes that with theology, which understands that these symbols of God, these symbols of the divine, must be taken symbolically rather than literally. Remember, symbolic is not less, it's more than the literal. When we have the literal, we only have this highest being who's not really God, who's not being itself. And as he goes on then, Einstein, along with some theologians as well as some atheists, make God a being, one cause among many, even the highest being, but still a being, one among many, rather than being itself, rather than that divine depth dimension in everything. Well, that leads us, last objection to Einstein's kind of methodology of criticizing theology and religion, brings us to point B. The term or the idea of a personal God or God as a person is symbolic for Tillich. Put the end quote there. Personal God is symbolic for all the reasons we've just said. God is not literally a person who's separated from everything else and occasionally intervenes and maybe violates the laws of nature, maybe is the God of the gaps here and there. No, God is in and through everything, working with the natural processes, the laws that God created, working with, allowing humans to create with God, respecting the freedom of human beings and other creatures. Okay, that leads us to the third and final part of number 4. And Tillich says that lest we be in danger of taking this idea of personal God literally, it's best to say that God must be supra-personal, super-personal, above, greater than the personal. And Tillich notes that Einstein does use that term super-personal himself. So Tillich is saying, well, if you had carried out that thought in the right direction, you would have come to what Tillich holds at the end of this chapter. So let me read this, or at least part of the closing paragraph that begins at the bottom of page 131. But why must the symbol of the personal be used at all when it comes to God? The answer can be given through a term used by Einstein himself, the supra-personal. The depth of being cannot be symbolized by objects taken from a realm which is lower than the personal. from the realm of things or subpersonal living beings. The superpersonal is not an it, or more exactly, it is a he as much as it is an it, and it is above both of them. Today, Tillich might go on to put it, but if the he or she element is left out, the it element transforms the alleged superpersonal above the personal into a subpersonal, below the personal, as usually happens in monism and pantheism. Again, remember that Einstein is a pantheist. And such a neutral subpersonal cannot grasp the center of our personality. It can satisfy our aesthetic feeling or our intellectual needs, but it cannot convert our will. It cannot overcome our loneliness, anxiety, and despair, all those concepts of existentialism. For as the philosopher Schelling says, only a person can heal a person, end quote. This is the reason that the symbol of the personal God is indispensable for living religion. It is a symbol, not an object, and it never should be interpreted as an object. And it is one symbol beside others, indicating that our personal center is grasped by the manifestation of the inaccessible ground and abyss of being. The end of today's lectures.